Hi, I'm Bill Goffe. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics at Penn State. I'd like to take a few moments here to talk about using research-based teaching methods. These are very common in STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And there's two hallmarks to them. First off, they're based upon cognitive science, that is fundamental understandings of how people learn. And there's also a lot of empirical support. In fact, maybe as many as 1,000 papers that back up the things we're talking about here. Let me illustrate several of them here today. The first one I want to describe is a so-called JIT, for just-in-time teaching. We'll illustrate how I use it to teach GDP. It's a flipped classroom method. That is, students go in, answer questions on readings before we touch upon it in class at all. Here's the questions I use. This first one is clearly an opinion question. There's really not a right or wrong answer to it, but it helps them better understand what is in GDP. So when it comes time for a quiz or exam, they do have some sense of these things. The second question is something I've found in the past they have difficulty with, so I want to get them thinking about that before class, so they come to class, they're better prepared. A common third JIT question is this one. Eric Mazur, a physicist at Harvard, a leading STEM researcher, advocates this on JITs to better understand student thinking. In fact, my second question here came directly from this type of third question. Students answer these questions for class. They're generously graded in course management software, Angel or Blackboard, and they're a small share of the grade. If you want to read more about JITs, you can try this website, Starting Point, funded by the National Science Foundation. Now let's see how this is used in class. So I use a lot of clicker questions in class. Typical class, 4 to 6, maybe even more. Here's a couple illustrations. So when we teach GDP, we oftentimes have examples like this, with a couple things being produced, with quantities and prices for 2 years, and a base year to illustrate how this works. But in this case, we're going to do it with a clicker question. So I present this data to my students, then I give them the following question: what would real GDP be in the second year, 2013? And give them 4 options. I give them 45, maybe 60 seconds to think about it, to enter in their vote on their iClicker. Then they vote, and then I see the results. Here's what happened in one of my classes a few weeks ago. I see this, they do not. So I was fairly happy. Half my students could figure this out with no lecture whatsoever by me on how to compute real or nominal GDP. They picked that up from the JIT. On the other hand, half my students did not understand, an F if you will. So rather than me describing it here, we invoke so-called peer instruction. They work with each other. I ask them to turn to a neighbor to try to convince each other of the correct answer. Again, they haven't seen these results yet, and ask them then to revote. This takes a couple minutes. The classroom erupts. They're talking about economics in a controlled fashion. Here's how the vote turned out then. Well, a few fewer students voted. About 80% of the class now does understand that. At this point, I'll reveal the answer and I'll ask students to explain their thinking, not only for the right questions, but for the wrong ones. And then we'll launch into further questions, not clicker ones. I'll ask them, what does D measure? What does A measure? And do you have any questions? So in part, the clicker questions are an entree into other topics. What they've found in STEM disciplines is that oftentimes students have trouble transferring something from one domain or one framework into another. This is an example of that. It's the following clicker question to the last one you saw. It turns out the blue one is real GDP, and half my students can figure that out at first. It's pretty even split, in fact, which makes it a great clicker question. A lot of people with the wrong idea, a lot of people with the right. We then use peer instruction again. They revote without seeing any of this data, and now we're up into the high C or perhaps even low B range. I then ask a student, what's your thinking on this? How do you explain this? I try to find a couple explanations so students now fully understand it. What's happening here is this, is we're invoking deliberate practice. Students are answering challenging but doable questions. In part, they're teaching each other the material. We're also using something called the testing effect, another hallmark of cognitive science. When you're asked something, you tend to remember it better than when you're told that very same thing. And this helps put it into their long-term memory as opposed to a lot of things they've seen in standard lecture that would fly out of their short-term memory because it'd be overloaded. Another question is this, that I asked again earlier this semester. As you probably know, students have a hard time distinguishing between inflation and the price level. So I used this question then. And I've also got them asking them about how sure they are about this. And this is another good clicker question with a wide variety of answers. The class is spread all across the board. We then do peer instruction again, and you can see how they then converge to the correct answer. And typically before I reveal the answer, I'll ask them for their thinking, how they might narrow it down, how they think about this, and then reveal the answer, talk about it a bit more to make sure at that point they're then on board. So to wrap up this talk, I want to talk about the technology used. Of course, it's very common, course or learning management software, Blackboard Angel. You can use Poll Everywhere. I've got some preference for iClickers, but Poll Everywhere is on cell phones, certainly easily usable. I find it fun to teach this way. It's a good challenge to develop these questions. And more importantly, they're research-based. They've been used a lot in STEM classes, and they've been shown to increase learning, in part because the fundamental foundation is how people learn. It's a very active classroom. Students aren't just watching or listening, they're actually trying and learning and using those hallmarks from cognitive science. It does stick. Bottom line here gives me a framework for thinking about teaching. There are substantial learning gains in the STEM disciplines. My own results here with a test of understanding of college economics, I typically give at the end of every semester, is my students end up at the 82nd percentile or so. The one time I gave at the start, they're at the 68th percentile. Another way to look at this is my students, over the course of the semester, can answer 8 more out of the 32 questions correctly. Nationally, you see about 4.3 questions answered correctly.